They called her Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, the longest reigning queen of modern times. To the world, she was dignity in pearls, grace in silence, and purity in a crown that never slipped. But behind palace gates, her reign was haunted by the same darkness that devoured every royal bed before her. Husbands with wandering eyes, sons with monstrous secrets, courtiers who turned her body into a rumor, her image into a weapon. This isn't the fairy tale they taught you. This is the curse of the last queen. Stay, listen, and subscribe before this truth is buried too. When Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor walked into Westminster Abbey on the day of her coronation in 1953, the world saw a goddess, a young woman in white, wrapped in jewels older than empires, holding the crown of saints and warriors. The cameras painted her as pure, untouched, sacred, the embodiment of Britain's survival after war. To millions, she was not simply a queen. She was hope in human form. But hope has shadows. Behind that crown lay a story older than Elizabeth herself, a curse whispered across centuries. Every queen who wore the crown before her was forced to play two roles: saint in public, sacrifice in private. The throne was a stage, and the woman who sat on it became the body on which politics, lust, and power were carved. Elizabeth II inherited this stage. The newspapers and church called her untouchable, but history was already mocking that word. Monarchs before her, Henry V, Charles T, Edward VIII, had turned royal bedrooms into theaters of sin. Kings feasted on women, discarded them, or used their bodies as bargaining chips. Queens, meanwhile, became symbols. Not flesh and blood, but living statues that carried the weight of dynasty. Elizabeth was born into this nightmare, long before the crown touched her head. The haunting truth: her image was never her own. As a child, Elizabeth grew up in a world where whispers already followed her bloodline. Her uncle, King Edward VIII, gave up the crown for a forbidden woman, Wallis Simpson, scandalizing Britain. Her father, George VI, became king by accident, terrified and broken by the duty. By the time Elizabeth rose to power, the monarchy was already seen as fragile, desperate for reinvention. And so, the men in suits, ministers, priests, and image makers, sculpted her into something supernatural, a virgin queen of the modern age. It wasn't just a coronation. It was a spell. The ritual of her crowning was drenched in ancient symbolism. Oils said to sanctify her flesh, robes said to shield her from corruption, chants that turned her into something beyond human. The people believed they were watching a ceremony. In truth, they were watching a possession. Elizabeth the woman was erased that day. In her place stood Elizabeth the myth. But myths always demand sacrifice. From that moment, her every smile was no longer hers. Her every silence was not choice but command. She was forbidden to show weakness, forbidden to bleed, forbidden to be human. To the world, she was untouchable purity. To herself, she became a prisoner in robes of gold, and the haunting irony: the purity they worshipped was not protection. It was a weapon against her. Across Europe, foreign courts sneered at the idea of Britain's sacred queen. Satirical sketches mocked her body, turning her into a joke of chastity. Whispers suggested that if kings could not conquer England through war, they would do so through her flesh. She became both shield and target, adored by her people, mocked by rivals, dissected by gossip. Elizabeth was young, but she was not naive. She understood the game. She knew her marriage to Prince Philip would never be free of whispers. She knew her children would inherit not just her blood, but the curse of royal rumor. And she knew that from the day the crown was lowered onto her head, her life no longer belonged to her. She was the last queen who had to carry the myth of purity, and the first to do it under the gaze of cameras, tabloids, and global media. Every wave, every word, every photograph was a performance. The public adored the performance, but the woman inside the crown haunted, because she knew what history had done to queens before her. Anne Boleyn executed for lust, Catherine Howard destroyed for youth, even Victoria mocked for her mourning and her passions. The crown promised glory but delivered grief. Elizabeth was trapped, and in the silence of palace walls, that trap grew darker. Rumors of her husband's wandering eyes began to slip through the cracks. Courtiers whispered of scandals that could shatter the myth of her perfect marriage. Foreign papers laughed at the idea of a faithful royal household. Yet Elizabeth said nothing. She wore her pearls, waved her hand, and carried on the performance. Because that was her prison. Her purity was never about her body. It was about control. The men who built her image made sure she could never escape it. To admit weakness, to confront scandal, to even hint at desire, all of that would destroy the illusion. So she played the role perfectly. She smiled while the shadows grew. She stood while her dynasty trembled. And she lived as the last monarch who could never truly live at all. The crown of purity was not a gift. It was a curse passed from ghost to ghost, queen to queen. And in Elizabeth it found its final victim. Because no matter how long she reigned, no matter how many waves she gave, the truth haunted every step she took. The woman had been erased, and in her place, only the myth survived. And myths do not die quietly. The palace bedrooms of kings and queens were never places of rest. They were battlegrounds. Behind velvet curtains, alliances were made, betrayals whispered, and lust devoured thrones faster than war. History is littered with queens who were crowned in public but broken in private. Elizabeth II, Alexandra Mary Windsor, inherited this ancient curse the moment she married Philip Mountbatten. To the world, their union in 1947 was a fairy tale, a young princess marrying a handsome naval officer. Newspapers called it love. Crowds cheered as they kissed on balconies. But inside the palace walls, the story was far darker. Prince Philip was not an ordinary husband. He was born into exile, carrying his own scars from a broken family in war. He entered marriage with the heart of a soldier, not the loyalty of a saint. Whispers followed him. Whispers of charm, of wandering eyes, of friendships with women that blurred into secrets. Elizabeth, now crowned and chained to the throne, could never escape those whispers. This was the haunting truth. Her bedroom was never her sanctuary. It was another stage. The crown had painted her as the perfect wife, the eternal virgin transformed into the faithful queen. But her husband's rumored affairs cracked that image like glass. Courtiers spoke in low voices of dinners attended without her, of nights when Philip vanished into London's shadows. Rumors of actresses, aristocrats, even dancers, all circling the name of the queen's consort. Nothing was ever proven, nothing needed to be. In the silence of the palace, suspicion itself was poison, and Elizabeth endured it all. She never confronted the whispers publicly. She never allowed herself to appear weak. She smiled beside him at ceremonies, nodded politely as cameras flashed, and played her role to perfection. But the silence came with a cost, because in that silence, she was no longer a wife, she was an image, an untouchable queen who could not cry, could not rage, could not demand answers. Imagine the horror of lying in a bed beside a man whose loyalty you doubt, and knowing you cannot speak, not because you are powerless, but because the entire survival of the monarchy depends on you pretending nothing is wrong. That was Elizabeth's haunted reality. The Windsor bedroom shadows grew heavier with time. The public adored the couple, but behind the golden curtains, their marriage carried the same sickness that had consumed kings for centuries: desire, temptation, and betrayal. Unlike ancient queens, Elizabeth could not be executed or divorced. Instead, she became a prisoner of performance. Every anniversary photograph was a mask. Every smile was armor. But the ghost of betrayal never left. Foreign papers whispered of Philip's connections. Satirists mocked the idea of a faithful royal marriage. Gossip magazines hinted at secret lives that would never be admitted. Elizabeth, bound by crown and silence, endured it all while presenting herself as unbreakable. Her purity was not the absence of scandal. It was the refusal to ever acknowledge it. And that silence haunted her family. Her children grew up watching their parents' tension bleed into the walls. Charles learned early that royal marriages were cages, not romances. Anne, Andrew, and Edward each carried their own scars of growing in a home where love was a duty, not a choice. The shadows in the bedroom became shadows in the bloodline. Philip remained by her side for decades, but the whispers never died. Even in old age, rumors clung to him like ghosts. And Elizabeth, until the very end, kept her silence. Perhaps it was strength, perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was the cruelest truth of monarchy that she could not be Elizabeth the woman, only Elizabeth the queen. The Windsor bedroom was more than a private space. It was a haunted chamber, echoing with centuries of royal sins. Elizabeth did not escape those echoes. She slept beside them. She ruled with them. She aged with them. And in the silence of night, the crown on the table beside her bed must have looked less like gold and more like chains. Because in the end, the shadows were not Philip's alone. They were the dynasty's curse, a curse that turned love into suspicion, loyalty into performance, and marriage into a ghostly bargain. Elizabeth wore the mask of purity until her final breath, but the darkness of the Windsor bedroom never truly left her side. Every crown is built on blood, but in the Windsor line that blood carried a curse of scandal, betrayal, and forbidden desire, passed like a ghost from one generation to the next. Elizabeth Sicca did not create this curse. She inherited it, and once it touched her, it never let go. The Windsor family looked perfect on the outside. Portraits showed them smiling, waving, frozen in golden frames, but those frames hid a history of shame. Before Elizabeth wore the crown, the throne had already been scarred by lust and obsession. It began with her uncle, King Edward VIII. He was supposed to be the great monarch of the age, charming, handsome, adored. But his heart was consumed by a forbidden love. Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. To the church, she was scandal. To the people, she was poison. And Edward chose her over the throne. In 1936, he abandoned the crown for passion. The monarchy was humiliated. Britain was shaken. And a shadow fell across the Windsor name. That shadow did not disappear. It slid directly onto Elizabeth's father, George VI. He was never meant to be king. He was shy, broken by a stammer, and terrified of the role. But the curse of Edward's lust forced him into power. The weight destroyed him slowly. By the time Elizabeth was crowned, she had already seen what the bloodline did. It devoured kings before their time. And so, she carried the curse forward. The Windsor line was haunted not only by abdication, but by centuries of sexual politics. Their very survival depended on controlling desire. Every marriage had to be a calculation, not love. Every child had to be produced for duty, not joy. It was less a family and more a breeding cage, designed to keep the dynasty alive. Elizabeth, as a young queen, became the guardian of this haunted cycle. But the curse spread like fire into her children. Charles, the heir, was raised under the weight of duty, but with the hunger for freedom. His arranged marriage to Diana was supposed to save the crown, but instead it dragged the monarchy into the darkest scandal of the 20th century. Charles's love for Camilla never died, and Diana's heartbreak became public spectacle. The curse of Edward VIII, choosing desire over duty, lived again, this time destroying a princess before the world's eyes. Andrew, the Queen's second son, fell even deeper into darkness. His friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, his name tied to accusations of abuse, turned the monarchy into a symbol of corruption. What Edward's forbidden affair had done in whispers, Andrew's scandal did in headlines. The Windsor curse had grown bolder, uglier, and inescapable. The haunting irony, through all this, Elizabeth remained untouched by direct scandal. But her blood carried it, her children embodied it, and her silence protected it. She became both prisoner and warden of a dynasty that seemed cursed to rot from within. It is said that dynasties die not by swords but by sins. For the Windsors, those sins were carved into the bedroom, the marriage bed, and the whispers of courtiers. Every affair, every betrayal, every scandal stained the bloodline deeper. Elizabeth's role was to stand above it, to pretend the curse did not exist. She dressed in pearls, smiled for cameras, and kept the illusion alive. But illusion cannot stop haunting. Every photograph of her children reminded her of the curse tightening around the crown. Every headline of scandal was another ghost pressing against palace walls. And still, she endured. But endurance came with a price: her humanity. She could not speak of her grief, could not condemn her own blood, could not admit that her family was cracking apart. To admit it would be to admit the monarchy was doomed. So she carried on, while the curse laughed behind her. Elizabeth Sue was the longest reigning monarch in British history. But longevity is not victory. It is survival. And survival in a haunted dynasty is not peace. It is torment. She reigned as a queen, but she lived as the keeper of a bloodline cursed by desire and betrayal. And the curse did not end with her. It lingers still, waiting for the next crown, the next marriage, the next scandal. Because Windsor blood is heavy, it does not heal, it haunts. Elizabeth knew this truth. She carried it in silence, and silence, in the end, became her crown. No curse is more cruel than the curse of love denied, and in the Windsor dynasty, love was never love. It was duty, strategy, and sacrifice. For Elizabeth Di's eldest son, Charles, that curse revealed itself in the form of two women, Diana Spencer and Camilla Parker Bowles. What began as a marriage meant to heal the monarchy turned into the most haunting scandal of the Queen's reign. The story was staged like a fairy tale. Diana, the young virgin bride, shy and wide-eyed, chosen to marry the heir to the throne. The wedding in 1981 was broadcast across the globe, painted as a modern romance to secure the future of the monarchy. Elizabeth sat on her throne watching, perhaps hoping this union would end the whispers, heal the bloodline, and restore the crown's purity. But purity was never part of the Windsor fate. From the beginning, Charles's heart belonged to another. Camilla was no secret lover of passion. She was the ghost that haunted Diana's marriage bed. Even on the wedding day, Diana later admitted, she felt Camilla's presence like a shadow behind her veil. The curse had followed her to the altar. The marriage quickly collapsed into torment. Charles and Diana lived together as strangers, their private rooms filled with silence, anger, and betrayal. The palace tried to mask the cracks, but the cameras could not hide the coldness in their smiles. And the public, who had adored Diana, began to see the tragedy unfolding. Diana became the victim of the Windsor curse, chosen not for love, but for image. She was sacrificed to the idea of monarchy, her youth consumed by duty. Yet Diana was not silent. Unlike queens before her, she spoke. She revealed the darkness inside the marriage, the affairs, the loneliness, the betrayal. And in speaking, she dragged the curse out of the shadows and into the daylight. The world learned of Charles's intimate conversations with Camilla. Tapes leaked. Scandals erupted. Newspapers feasted. A future king confessing his forbidden love to another woman while married to the mother of his children. The Windsor image cracked into shards. For Elizabeth, it was the ultimate humiliation, her heir exposed as unfaithful, her dynasty mocked as corrupt. And Diana, she became both a martyr and a ghost, loved by the people, rejected by the crown. She wandered the palace halls as a prisoner of fame and heartbreak. Her eyes, once full of innocence, turned hollow with despair. The curse consumed her youth until there was nothing left but silence and tragedy. When Diana died in 1997, the curse claimed its most famous victim. A princess who was meant to save the monarchy was instead buried by it. Crowds wept in the streets, flowers buried the palace gates, and the queen herself was forced to step out of her silence. For once, Elizabeth broke the mask, bowing her head before Diana's coffin, a silent acknowledgement of guilt, of grief, of the curse she could never stop. But the ghost of Diana did not vanish with her body. Her presence lingered, haunting Charles and Camilla for decades. Even as the two eventually married in 2005, the world never forgot the woman destroyed by their love. Camilla became queen consort years later, but Diana remained the eternal, people's princess, the shadow at every royal banquet, the whisper in every photograph. For Elizabeth, this scandal was more than family drama. It was history repeating itself. Just as Edward VIII had abandoned duty for passion, Charles had chosen love over tradition. Just as other royal marriages had crumbled under lust and betrayal, Diana's fate proved that the Windsor curse lived on. The monarchy survived, but it was scarred forever. The haunting truth is that Diana's story was not just personal tragedy. It was part of the dynasty's ancient pattern. Queens and princesses offered as sacrifices, their bodies and hearts consumed by the needs of the throne. Kings and princes wandering into desire, tearing the illusion of purity apart. And always Elizabeth, silent, enduring, haunted, forced to stand above it all, even as her family burned beneath her. The world remembers Diana's funeral as a moment of grief. But for the Windsors, it was a reminder that their bloodline was cursed. No matter how tightly they clung to crowns and ceremonies, the bedroom scandals, the forbidden desires, The betrayals would always return. Charles and Camilla survived, but the ghost of Diana ensured they would never escape judgment. And Elizabeth, until her dying day, carried the weight of that ghost on her shoulders. A reminder that no crown, no matter how heavy, can silence the curse of royal blood. Some curses strike quietly like whispers in the dark. Others arrive like a storm, tearing everything apart in plain sight. For Queen Elizabeth II, the most shameful wound of her reign did not come from foreign wars or political enemies. It came from within her own blood. Her son, Prince Andrew. If Charles's scandals had cracked the monarchy, Andrew's sins dragged it into the mud. He was once known as the handsome prince, the dashing naval officer, the Queen's beloved second son. In the early years, he was painted as the golden child, free from the burdens Charles carried, yet close enough to the throne to embody royal charm. The newspapers called him Randy Andy, celebrating his appetite for parties, glamour, and women. But beneath the smiles and uniforms, a darker hunger stirred. The curse of Windsor desire does not simply ruin marriages, it devours innocence itself. Andrew's downfall came in the form of Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire predator whose world of power, money, and flesh intersected with royalty. When Andrew stepped into Epstein's circle, he stepped into a labyrinth of horror that would stain his name forever. The friendship was not hidden. Andrew visited Epstein's mansions, flew on his private jets, attended his parties. There were photographs, witnesses, and eventually, accusations. Women came forward, young, far too young, claiming they had been trafficked, used, and delivered into Andrew's company. The stories were shocking, grotesque, and damning. The prince who once wore medals of honor now carried the stench of corruption. For Elizabeth, this scandal was unlike any before. Diana's tragedy had broken hearts, but Andrew's sins broke morality. The monarchy had always been haunted by affairs, whispers of bastards, forbidden love. But this was darker. This was predation. This was evil dressed in royal robes. The world watched as Andrew tried to defend himself. In a disastrous interview, he denied everything, his words stumbling, his face sweating, his arrogance unmasked. Instead of saving his image, he buried it. He spoke of not being able to sweat, of pizza dinners, of strange denials that sounded like lies. The haunted truth became clear. The prince was guilty not just of sins, but of shamelessness. The monarchy reeled. Here was the Queen's own son, entangled in one of the darkest scandals of modern history. Andrew's titles were stripped, his public duties erased. For the first time in centuries, a royal was not just mocked but exiled from his own dynasty's stage. He became a ghost prince, alive but banished, his name cursed. But the curse did not stop with him. It wrapped itself around Elizabeth's crown. The people ask, how could the Queen, the symbol of duty and virtue, allow such corruption in her house? The palace tried silence. They buried statements, erased appearances, hid Andrew from view. But the world did not forget. The haunting stayed. What made this scandal so chilling was not just the accusations, but the ancient pattern it revealed. The Windsors, like monarchs of old, believed they were untouchable. Kings of history indulged in cruelty, lust, and forbidden pleasures, protected by their crowns. But history always punished them. Thrones toppled, dynasties ended, curses bloomed. Andrew was not the first royal to be swallowed by his appetites. He was simply the latest chapter in a story that stretched back centuries. And Elizabeth, she bore the pain in silence. She had weathered wars, deaths, betrayals, and divorces. But this, her own son disgraced by horrors too grotesque to cleanse, this was a wound that never healed. Even in her final years, Andrew lingered in the background, a shadow at her side. He followed her coffin in the funeral procession, unwanted yet unavoidable, a living reminder of the dynasty's rot. The haunting truth is that Andrew's scandal was not just about him. It revealed the monarchy itself, fragile, decayed, infected by the sins of its own blood. Once upon a time, kings could bury their horrors in castles and dungeons. But in the age of cameras and whispers turned into headlines, the ghosts cannot be silenced. They scream in the open, louder than any crown can command. Prince Andrew will never sit on a throne. He will never be remembered as a hero or even a statesman. He will be remembered as the cursed prince, the embodiment of everything the monarchy tried to hide. And Elizabeth, the queen who endured it all, carried that shame with her to the grave. Because in the end, that is the fate of the Windsors, to live in palaces of gold, but sleep under shadows of sin. The curse does not care about crowns. It only feeds on blood. No queen can ever truly rule her own image. That power belongs to the world outside her palace walls. The gossipers, the satirists, the foreign courts hungry to cut her down. For Elizabeth, too, the crown was not just a weight of jewels and duty. It was also a mirror that reflected every sin of her family back at her. Though her own body remained untouched by direct scandal, her silence became the prison in which she lived. The foreign courts remembered history well. Europe has always mocked queens who claimed purity. Centuries earlier, Elizabeth I had been called the Virgin Queen, and Catholic Europe filled their pamphlets with vile drawings, turning her into a sexual caricature. The same cruelty returned for Elizabeth II. Though she had branded herself as the devoted wife, the dutiful sovereign, and the untouchable matriarch, her family betrayed that image again and again. And the world laughed. Charles's affair with Camilla, Diana's confessions, Andrew's monstrous scandals, each headline became a dagger. Global tabloids, especially across Europe and America, twisted these sins into grotesque theater. Newspapers printed lurid details with mocking titles: The Queen's Rotten Son, The People's Princess Betrayed by the Crown, The Royal Pedophile. Elizabeth's body was never accused of lust or weakness, but her crown, her very essence, was dissected by association. She had built a facade of purity, yet her court became a carnival of disgrace. Foreign monarchies mocked her silently, their courtiers whispering behind fans and closed doors. To them, the Windsor house was not a dynasty of glory but of filth. They sneered, how could the pure queen preside over such impure children? Kings and queens in Spain, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, all watched with satisfaction as Britain's shining crown grew darker. For centuries, Britain had looked down on Europe, preaching its superiority. Now Elizabeth's family scandals made her a spectacle, a reminder that her throne was not holier, only more exposed. The tabloids became the new foreign courts, louder, crueler, and merciless. They paraded Diana's pain like entertainment. They hunted Meghan like prey. They dug up Andrew's sins with relish. And through it all, Elizabeth remained silent. That silence, once her shield, became her torment, because silence in the face of cruelty is not strength, it is surrender. The Queen's silence fed the mockery. To the outside world, she appeared complicit, as if her crown had purchased her the right to ignore the blood dripping from her dynasty. Each time she refused to speak, the laughter grew, and soon the ridicule was not only about Charles or Andrew, it was about her. She became the silent monarch presiding over a haunted carnival. The cruelty of the world was a theater without mercy. Caricatures were drawn of her as a cold matron, presiding over perversions with her pearls and teacup. Articles described her palace not as a home of dignity, but as a brothel of betrayal. Even in moments of grief, Diana's death, Andrew's disgrace, Harry's exile, her silence was twisted. The tabloids asked, "Does the Queen feel? Or is her heart as frozen as her smile?" This was her torment. Her body was never touched by rumor, but her silence allowed others to carve her reputation as they pleased. She had outlived scandals, survived wars, endured the fall of empires. Yet the only thing she could not control was the way the world mocked her family's sins. And there lies the haunted truth: Elizabeth herself became part of the theater of cruelty. By refusing to speak, she became a performer in it, a monarch whose image of purity made the impurity of her court even more grotesque, a queen whose silence echoed louder than any confession. History will not remember her simply as the longest reigning monarch. It will remember the strange irony that while her body was untouched, her legacy was dissected by whispers, jokes, and ridicule. She survived, yes, but she survived as a symbol of endurance wrapped in scandal, a queen who could not control her own story. The theater of cruelty closed only with her death. Yet even in the silence of her coffin, the whispers continued. The tabloids still write, the foreign courts still laugh, and the world still remembers. The pure queen ruled over an impure court, And in that cruel irony, the Windsor curse remains alive. 70 years is a long time to wear a mask. Too long, behind the polished pearls, the velvet robes, and the ceremonial smile, there lived a woman who was never allowed to be only a woman. Elizabeth II, Alexandra Mary Windsor, became queen at 25, and from that day until her last breath, she surrendered her body, her heart, and her soul to silence. The crown was not simply gold and jewels. It was a cage. It devoured her youth, stole her laughter, and chained her to duty. Every betrayal, every scandal, every humiliation that her family unleashed upon her court was not just a political blow. It was a wound carved into her flesh. And yet, the curse demanded she never scream, never cry in public, never rage. Her discipline became her armor. She turned suffering into ritual, grief into control. While the world mocked her children, while tabloids exposed her dynasty's filth, while foreign courts whispered of her family's impurity, she held her head high and said nothing. That silence was not peace. It was punishment. It was the ghostly toll of a woman condemned to endure. Think of her nights. Alone in vast palaces of stone and gold, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had also hidden their sins. Her husband, Philip, distant and unfaithful in his own ways. Her children, entangled in divorces, betrayals, scandals, even crimes. Her kingdom shrinking, her empire collapsing. And she, a small, aging woman in her bedchamber, carrying the shame of it all. The crown did not comfort her, it haunted her. Elizabeth never wept before the world, but behind closed doors. Imagine the grief that must have stalked her steps. Diana's death, a daughter-in-law she could not save. Andrew's disgrace, a son she could not defend. Harry's exile, a grandson she could not hold on to. Each betrayal was not just political loss. It was personal heartbreak. Yet she swallowed it, buried it, let it rot inside her. Because a queen cannot be human. And that is the tragedy. She was never allowed to be human. To the world, she was a symbol, an institution, a living statue. To her family, she was the monarch first, mother second. She was the ghost of duty haunting her own bloodline. Even in moments of joy, weddings, births, jubilees, she appeared not as a grandmother or mother, but as the crown incarnate. Her smile was rehearsed, her gestures memorized, her voice measured to the second. Humanity was stripped from her like flesh from bone. This is the haunted truth. Elizabeth lived 70 years in silence, and silence consumed her. It became her discipline, yes, but also her torment. The world praised her for endurance, for stability, for never breaking. But what is endurance if not a kind of death? What is stability if it demands that a woman bury her feelings so deep she ceases to exist? Elizabeth became a ghost long before she died. A ghost in pearls, walking through ceremonies, waving from balconies, smiling to her subjects. She was loved, adored, even worshipped, but rarely seen as human. No one asked what she wanted, what she feared, whom she loved, what she lost. She was a prisoner dressed in robes of majesty. Behind the crown was a lonely woman, a haunted woman, a woman who carried the betrayals of her family like a secret illness, who transformed grief into silence, because silence was the only survival she knew. She gave herself to the role so completely that there was nothing left of Elizabeth the girl, the wife, the mother. Only Elizabeth the queen. 70 years of silence left scars that history cannot see but must feel. When she died, the world mourned the monarch. But perhaps the deeper tragedy is that few mourned the woman. Few remembered that beneath the jewels and crowns, there was once a young girl who laughed, who dreamed, who wanted to live. That girl was buried long before her body entered the tomb. The haunted woman behind the crown lived and died unseen, and that is the cruelest curse of all. No dynasty survives 7 decades without allies. For Elizabeth II, those allies were not always ministers or armies. They were the men with pens, the editors with headlines, the cameras that could either destroy or protect her image. The monarchy, fragile and full of scandal, was shielded by a web of silence, a silence carefully bought, managed, and enforced. The public saw a polished family, smiling royals on the balcony, weddings turned into fairy tales, births announced with trumpets, jubilees filled with music and gold. But beneath this glittering theater, there was rot, affairs, betrayals, corruption, cruelty, and yet the newspapers rarely dared to pierce the mask. Why? because the palace and the press had a pact of complicity. Stories were buried. Photographs were hidden. Reporters were silenced with favors, with access, with threats. A scandal that could have burned the monarchy was quietly softened into a whisper. An affair became a rumor. A crime became a misunderstanding. A predator prince was still called His Royal Highness. The media played its role in the theater of cruelty, protecting the crown at the cost of truth. But every buried secret has a ghost. Take Prince Philip's rumored infidelities, whispers of mistresses and midnight visits. The papers knew, but they never screamed. They obeyed. They printed photographs of him beside Elizabeth, smiling, waving, as if the Queen's marriage was unbreakable. The truth was silenced, but the silence itself haunted Elizabeth. She endured not only betrayal but also the knowledge that the world was pretending not to see. Charles and Camilla. For years, their affair was an open secret, yet the tabloids played along with the fairy tale of Charles and Diana. Only when the dam broke, when tapes leaked, when Diana herself spoke, did the truth spill out. By then, the silence had done its damage. The crown had forced a young woman into misery to preserve an illusion. Elizabeth, watching from her throne, knew it all. She carried the weight of both the lie and its collapse. And then there was Andrew, the darkest scandal of all. For decades, rumors circled him. His appetite for parties, for women, for the dangerous friendship of Jeffrey Epstein. The press could have exposed him earlier, but the monarchy's grip kept the worst buried, until the day came when the truth could no longer be denied. And when it exploded, the shame was greater because of the years of silence before it. This is the curse of cover-ups. Every buried scandal becomes a ghost that whispers louder with time. Elizabeth may have believed that silence was armor, that secrecy protected her reign, but each cover-up only deepened her torment. The mask of purity she wore became heavier, sharper, cutting into her flesh. For every headline softened, for every photograph hidden, she was haunted by what lay beneath. The monarchy controlled images like a weapon. Carefully staged portraits, carefully edited speeches, carefully chosen appearances. Even grief was scripted. The Queen's face at Diana's funeral, her words after national tragedies, her televised Christmas messages. Everything was polished, rehearsed, controlled. But what happens when a life is turned into a performance? The performer becomes a prisoner. Elizabeth's crown was both armor and cage. It protected her from public humiliation, yes, but it also imprisoned her inside a world where nothing was real. Her family's sins were hidden, yet never erased. They festered in silence, like corpses buried under marble floors. She walked through her palaces surrounded not just by ancestors, but by ghosts of stories never told. The press, once her shield, eventually became her executioner. The same newspapers that had buried Philip's affairs and softened Andrew's sins eventually feasted on Diana's pain, on Meghan's exile, on every crack in the Windsor mask. The pact of silence had limits, and when the media finally turned, it turned with cruelty, as if punishing the Queen for every year she had forced them to pretend. Elizabeth lived 70 years inside this cage of complicity. She was both its master and its victim. She demanded silence, and she received it. But that silence poisoned her court. Because when truth is buried, it does not die. It waits, it haunts, and when it rises, it destroys not only the sinner, but the one who kept the secret. Thus the Queen's crown, the symbol of power, became her torment. It gave her the strength to outlast wars, governments, empires. But it also locked her inside a haunted theater where every secret echoed, every silence screamed, and every cover-up became another ghost at her side. The monarchy survived, but Elizabeth paid the price, and when the crown finally left her head in death, the cage remained, passed on to the next generation, already trembling with its own sins, its own ghosts. In her final years, Elizabeth sat on her throne like a shadow. The world still bowed before her, the ceremonies still glimmered with gold, but behind her eyes lay the weight of 70 years of silence. The crown no longer looked like glory. It looked like a ghost chained to her head. The first blow came in 2021 with the death of Prince Philip, her husband of 73 years. For decades, Philip had been both her torment and her companion, the restless consort whose rumored affairs cut her heart but whose presence gave her strength. When he died, the silence in Windsor Castle grew unbearable. The Queen sat alone at his funeral, the image of a widow dressed in black, her body small and frail under the weight of grief. The photograph of her sitting apart, masked and isolated, became a haunting symbol of her reign, a woman forever alone, forced to grieve in silence before the eyes of the world. But death did not bring peace. Instead, it opened the gates for scandal. Prince Andrew's sins, whispered about for years, erupted in public fury. Accusations of exploitation, of ties to Jeffrey Epstein, of young victims brought before him. The world no longer whispered, it shouted. The Queen's son was dragged into courtrooms of public opinion, stripped of titles, disgraced beyond repair, and Elizabeth, she stood silent once again. The pure Queen now carried the shame of an impure son, a son whose name became synonymous with corruption. The monarchy's armor cracked in her final years, and the shame fell directly upon her shoulders. As if Andrew's scandal was not enough, another storm rose. Meghan and Harry, the grandson she had once adored, the boy who walked behind Diana's coffin, now stood against the throne itself. In interviews and memoirs, Harry and Meghan accused the monarchy of cruelty, of betrayal, of racism. They spoke of conversations about the color of their unborn child's skin, of being silenced and suffocated within the palace. These were not just family quarrels. They were accusations that the very institution Elizabeth had spent her life protecting was built on cruelty and prejudice. For Elizabeth, the silence became unbearable. How could she respond? For 70 years, she had chosen silence as her weapon, her armor. But in these final storms, silence no longer felt like power. It felt like hollowness. Every time she refused to answer, the world filled the silence with its own conclusions. Her strength was mistaken for coldness. Her restraint was seen as guilt. What had once been dignity was now read as indifference. The theater of cruelty reached its final act. Elizabeth, old and frail, watched as her dynasty collapsed around her. Philip gone, Andrew disgraced, Harry and Meghan exiled, turning their pain into books and television spectacles. Even Charles, her heir, remained haunted by Diana's ghost and the shadow of Camilla. The Queen could not fight these ghosts, she could only endure them. But endurance had lost its meaning. The silence she had built her throne upon was now her tormentor, echoing louder with every scandal. The image of Elizabeth in her last years was not that of a triumphant monarch. It was of a haunted woman, moving slowly, her body failing, her eyes heavy with sorrow. At ceremonies, she appeared as a relic, fragile, almost spectral, a queen who was already half a ghost. The people still adored her, but the adoration was tinged with pity. She had outlived them all, but at what cost? Her reign ended not in triumph but in shadows. She had once been the young girl who promised to devote her life to service. And she kept that promise. But the price was devastating. 70 years of silence had consumed her humanity, leaving behind only the symbol. The crown on a frail body, the mask of a queen hiding the haunted woman beneath. When Elizabeth finally died in 2022, the world mourned the monarch. But in truth, she had been dying for years. Every betrayal, every scandal, every silence had chipped away at her. The woman beneath the crown was gone long before her body was laid in the tomb. What remained was shadow, and so her final years stand as the darkest proof of the Windsor curse that the crown, once thought to protect, becomes a cage. That silence, once thought to be power, becomes hollow, and that even the longest reign cannot escape the ghosts of blood, scandal, and grief. Elizabeth's throne outlasted time, but the woman who sat upon it was consumed by shadows. In September 2022, the silence finally ended. Elizabeth T., the woman who had carried the crown longer than any monarch in history, breathed her last. Yet even in death, silence surrounded her. It was as if the queen had vanished into shadow, leaving behind only the ghost of her reign. The world responded with a mourning so vast, it felt almost ancient. Bells tolled across cities, church choirs filled the air with solemn hymns, and millions lined the streets to glimpse her coffin. From London to Lagos, from New Delhi to New York, the grief spread like smoke. Crowds wept as if they had lost a grandmother, a mother, a guardian of time itself. The Queen's passing seemed to crack open the sky, reminding the world that an era had ended. But beneath the mourning, irony twisted like a dagger. Elizabeth died with her image intact, the dutiful, pure, untouchable monarch. She had succeeded in her final performance, to die as the unshaken symbol of stability. Yet the dynasty she left behind was drowning in scandal, shame, and fractured loyalties. It was a cruel paradox. She carried her purity into the grave, while her family remained scarred by betrayal, lust, and disgrace. Foreign monarchies and tabloids did not hesitate. Some wept, others mocked. The last queen, they called her, but also the Queen of Silence. They praised her for her devotion, but whispered about the shadows that outlived her. The Andrew scandal had not vanished. Meghan and Harry's accusations still echoed across the Atlantic. Charles's crown, though prepared for decades, sat heavy with the memory of Diana and the controversies of Camilla. The monarchy survived Elizabeth, but its image was fractured, its foundation unsteady. The funeral itself became a theater of contrasts. On one side, the dazzling rituals, golden carriages, military salutes, a sea of black-clad mourners. On the other, the haunted truths, estranged family members walking stiffly behind her coffin, scandals lingering like uninvited ghosts at the procession. Even in death, Elizabeth was not free from the shadow of her dynasty. Her body was paraded with reverence, but the world's eyes also searched the faces of her children and grandchildren, reading the cracks in the family she had spent her life protecting. The haunting lay not only in her death, but in the silence that followed. She had ruled through wars, divorces, betrayals, and tragedies, and through it all she had refused to speak. She never explained, never defended, never confessed. That silence was her greatest weapon, but also her most lasting curse. The scandals buried in her reign now live on, restless, because silence never killed them. It only delayed them, and now, with her gone, they returned louder than ever. Historians will write of Elizabeth's strength, her dignity, her devotion. They will call her the last great monarch of Britain, the one who carried the empire's fading glory with grace. But the truth is darker. She was also the woman who carried 70 years of secrets into the grave, who let silence stand where truth should have been spoken. And that silence, though it protected her image, left her dynasty exposed. Her death was not an ending, it was a haunting. For every tear shed at her funeral, there was a whisper about Andrew, a question about Harry, a shadow of Diana. For every hymn sung in her honor, there was the quiet memory of rumors, scandals, and betrayals that her silence had never erased. The Queen left the stage with her mask intact, but behind the mask, the ghosts remained. In the end, the monarchy survived her, but just barely. Charles took the crown, but it was not the same. The magic was gone. The awe had faded. Without Elizabeth's silent strength, the cracks in the House of Windsor became too visible to ignore. And so the greatest irony of her reign became her legacy, that her silence, once seen as noble, will forever haunt the institution she swore to protect. Elizabeth II will be remembered as the last queen, a woman who endured, who kept her image pure even as the world around her rotted. But she will also be remembered as a ghostly figure, a monarch who allowed silence to become her greatest companion and her most dangerous inheritance. The crown rests now on another head. The ceremonies continue, the rituals repeat, but the silence remains echoing from her grave. Because silence, once unleashed, never truly dies. It lingers, it haunts, and so, even in death, Elizabeth reigns, not as a living monarch, but as a shadow across the throne. The monarchy survived her, but her silence will forever haunt its legacy,